Hi, this is Mehdi,
Hey, this is Fran.
and this is Total Tactics Football. So today we will be talking about Spain's game against Sweden last night. Fran, what did you make of this performance by Luis Enrique's side? And there was a lot of talk about maybe they didn't perform so well, and that Sweden had a defensive masterclass. But in your opinion, what did you feel like how the game went?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, Sweden in a sense had got what they wanted out of the game, right? They wanted really a draw, and you could see that with the substitutes. I think, substituting Isaac early was an indication that Sweden wanted to kind of protect the result and perhaps even save Isaac for future games where I think they have more potential of winning and kind of advancing because a draw versus Spain is absolutely necessary in that group, given the fact that they're probably going to be the strongest team, I think, in theory, at least on paper. And of course, coming into the game, Spain had a lot of question marks over it. First of all, there were a lot of kind of issues with the squad selection. A lot of people questioning why 24 players were selected. And then, of course, the kind of COVID impacts. We saw even the under 21 team play in one of the preluding games of the tournament. And as a result of the COVID kind of impacts, a lot of players were playing and training individually, which we'll talk about later, I think, in terms of how that impacted Spain's performance. But in terms of this game, I think you saw a very dominant Spanish side, and they weren't really playing tiki-taka just for the sake of tiki-taka. I think that those kind of comparisons you could see in perhaps the previous World Cups and where Spain faltered, and I think were very, very aimless with possession. Here we actually did see, I think, Spain create a lot of significant chances in the first and second half. And I think a lot of people kind of looked at the result, looked at 0-0, looked at the high amount of possession, and kind of made a summary of the game and compared the Spanish side to previous years where I think they were very aimless and fruitless in attack. I thought the Spanish side had a lot more physicality to it in terms of how hard they kind of pressure teams from the front, because I think that's the key thing, right? So in the first half, you could see the amount of times that Morata, despite his poor performance in terms of clinicalness, how many times he would press the keeper alongside Ferran Torres. So those kind of forced a lot of distributions back into the Spanish half and allowed Spain to create building with a high line. And I think the key difference in the Spanish side is that both these fullbacks are very capable in terms of being an engine on both sides of the pitch. Alba, of course, is not known necessarily for defense, but his ability to actually make these runs back and forth is what provides the side a lot of dynamicism. And of course, we now have Laporte in the system. And it means that I think Spain has a solid back line to play off of. And I think one of the key things in this game going, before the game started was the introduction of Pedri into the side. So what do you think about the impact of bringing Pedri on, and how do you think that affected the kind of first half?
So right, I mean, the other alternative to Pedri would be Fabian Ruiz or Thiago in that midfield. And as talented and technical those two players are, they're not the most final third players, the ones who will be looking to break through that line between the defense and midfield. Someone who's going to be looking for a lateral pass, and that's where Pedri comes in. He's your connector between your midfield and your attack, and he's excellent because he also has the ability to go out wide with the ball and play inwards, and that creates those triangles on the flanks, giving Spain that opportunity to use that possession in a meaningful way, as you were mentioning before, because that is exactly, you were absolutely spot on, because the difference between the older Spanish sides, after the great era, and this is that they have a plan to, use that possession in a smart way. Even though that they will hold and they will move from side to side, they will be looking to switch quickly and to be able to break through the line. So where I think Pedri makes a lot of sense to in this team is because he is also a great ball carrier. He's going to grab the ball and maybe turn. First thing he looks to do is always look and turn towards the opposition half, so that can help you break through a press, and open up some space for Alba maybe out wide, or Morata, who can come and play with him, and Dani Olmo, who plays in that channel in between the fullbacks and the center backs. So I think a player like him is very important for the Spanish side, because you don't want too many players who are going to want the ball and sit deep like Koke or Thiago or Rodri. You want someone in there who can be able to either like switch it up. So kind of like an example I would say is the Mount, who's playing in the English side right now.
Mm.
You've got Calvin Phillips and Declan Rice, but what Mount does is he always looks to grab the ball and turn towards the opposition. He's looking to make that pass, those links, those 1-2s, or to release the runners in. And this Spanish side actually has a few runners, which I quite like, with Ferran Torres playing on that right hand side coming in, and then the just workhorse. Lorente, who's just bombarding up and down that right hand side. It's incredible to see how he covers so much space with so much energy, and that's probably the influence Simeone has implemented onto his game. But yeah, looking on, we're going to talk about the first half of the game. Fran, how did you feel the Spanish side started? Because I was quite impressed for the first 20 minutes. I felt like they had the right intensity. They pegged Sweden back so much. The only thing that was missing for me was there were maybe sometimes so many opportunities for them to switch the play, but they couldn't.
Yeah.
Either didn't take that chance too quickly, or maybe when they did, their pass wasn't the most accurate one, so that the game moved a little back, and by then Sweden had recovered.
Yeah, I think one of the key ways that we can see this is I think Spain played very left side dominant because of Pedri's impact on the game, and actually also the impact of having two kind of left-footed defenders. It just seems the case where I think Spain is much more comfortable passing out of the back from the left, because when you see, for example, Laporte, he's not so used to passing actually to the right side of the flank. Very often you'd see players like Koke or Marcos Llorente throw their hands up because they didn't feel like they got the ball early. And by the time they got the ball, there were no kind of players in spaces, and the attack broke down and Spain had to go back. What I didn't like about the first half about Spain, despite the kind of positives that you mentioned, was the fact that they weren't really looking for those runs in behind. So Ferran Torres at times would make a run behind, or even Marcos Llorente, but there was no synergy there. And perhaps that owes a little bit of fault to the fact that the Spanish team had to train individually, and they haven't had time to kind of practice on these triangles, or even these kind of runs that they want to create through having these kind of fullbacks as engines. And for me, I think the best contrast of that from the first half to the second half was, for example, Jordi Alba's positioning. He was very static, I think, in the first half, very much like a kind of out-and-out winger who stuck by the touchline and didn't try to kind of run past this man, which you see so often for Barcelona, where he actually runs through the right back and through the center back through that kind of vertical gap, right? And I think perhaps one of the impacts of that too is how Sweden defended from the first to the second half. I thought in the first half, as you mentioned, Spain should have switched the ball a lot more often. Why? Because Sweden were playing much more narrow. If you look at the way that they kind of postured, there were no vertical spaces in between them because they were so narrow, and they were actually completely opening up that space. So, for example, Pedri would be the only player who would switch the ball sometimes, but there just wasn't that kind of confidence there from, let's say, someone like Laporte to switch to the flank. But then later on, I think when the substitutes came on for Spain, and when Sweden decided to play a little bit more wide in the second half, due to perhaps some of the substitutions, such as Oyarzabal coming in, and also Sarabia, we actually saw Jordi Alba start to make these kind of runs forwards, and we saw very great vertical passes forward from Pedri, which I think was exactly why he was brought onto the side. For me, that was the positive, I think, from the second half. But there was still an early portion of the second half before the substitutes came on where Spain were very, very, very dire. And I think that's where Isaac was actually able to pounce on Spain. And I think, honestly, the best player in the game for me, just from a player who was able to create something from nothing, really was Isaac. I think he was able to kind of run down the byline for Spain. I mean, honestly, while he was marked or double teamed, was able to kind of create skills to kind of maneuver that Spanish defense. Almost had two chances on goal, one where he was able to create a very poorly missed chance by Berg, and one where Marcos Llorente almost kind of created an own goal that would have actually gone to the side netting. Outside if Marcos Llorente wasn't there anyways. But still, it was only Isaac who was able to create a significant threat for Sweden. Otherwise, I think Spain was relatively unchallenged, but they were still quite fruitless until the substitutes came on. But I mean, when we contrast, the impact of Isaac, I mean, how do you feel about Morata's performance? It was clear, I think he was the main highlight, I think, in terms of like a detriment for the Spanish side.
True. I mean, just before we jump on to Morata, I did want to say, like, I did like some of the moves that Spain was trying to implement behind the back line. So what I was looking at was every time they went out, you would have Morata either drop, and that would kind of bring the center back line or the defensive line a bit forward, and then they would look to play that ball over the top. And I know the Spanish side isn't the tallest, but I think that tactic really works well because they're looking to attack the space behind the defenders, and that's where the Dani Olmo chance comes in. He's, Ferran Torres, I believe it was, to be able to put that ball in behind. Dani Olmo does really good, I think, but the keeper has, makes a
Yeah,
magnificent save. Um, but yeah, like, and those movements really worked, and this is a sort of style that I think they also kind of tried against that Germany side where they won 6-0. They did have a left footer in midfield in that game with Fabian Ruiz, or it was Canales, depending on. Canales was subbed for Fabian Ruiz, but it's the movement where you go out wide, but then you have a runner in behind the defensive line to be able to reach onto that ball. But yeah, Morata did really well originally. He came in, he looked confident with his pressing. He was doing all that was necessary until the ball dropped to his foot and he missed that chance. And for me, since as soon as he did that, you could see his body language change. Like he looked like just devoid of all confidence. He
yeah,
wasn't making runs into the box anymore. He was looking to be the man who wouldn't get the ball. And
yeah,
that is a problem because you need Spain needs a striker that can be able to link up in the style that Luis Enrique likes to play. He wants him to drop and link with his the runners in behind, and at the same time you need that striker to be running into the box. It's a tough job, which not a lot of strikers can do, and I guess maybe that's why Gerard Moreno maybe wasn't preferred. But
yeah,
second half, looking at Gerard Moreno when coming in against a team that sat deep, and probably the next two games possibly could be where the other opposition maybe might be sitting deep, seeing how much Spain held possession in this game, could open the opportunity for Gerard Moreno to come in and have a good game. I think he's a good striker. Um, he has 30 goals this season, which is incredible, and but I feel this maybe trust in Morata sometimes is a bit discouraging, because there's many managers, he's gone to big clubs, he's performed very well, he doesn't have a bad record, but it's the fact that these chances, they will come back to haunt you at one point. It kind of feels like a Higuain issue. Like, a good striker, he's going to score a lot of goals over a long period, but maybe when it comes to cup competitions, maybe the pressure can get to him. I do think with Morata, he just puts his head down after that miss. And look at the big strikers like Cavani's and your Aguero's. They missed a lot of chances. That's fine, but they will still have the persistence to continue to attack the same spaces and get the goal for themselves. But where Morata, he's a moment, if his confidence is high, he's great. But if it isn't, that can affect him and for a good patch.
yeah. No, and I think the impact of the way that Spain play is that you still need someone central. And I think as soon as he kind of missed that chance, he also really stopped staying central to the ball. I mean, he was not moving up and down the flank, but rather left towards the left side, almost going outside of the box. And it was really pathetic because of the way Jordi Alba was positioned as well. Jordi Alba was not really making these vertical runs forward. So in effect, kind of Spain was overloading the left flank, but there weren't really any options in behind for them in those central spaces. So in terms of cutbacks or even options to kind of play through the left, it really got jammed up there because of Morata's lack of want to kind of attack, I think, from that point on. And of course, Moreno did show, even in his limited time, like that he wanted to attack centrally. He had a great header, and he also had several other kind of chances where at least he was inside the box and able to lay off players. For me, I think he needs to continue playing going forwards. But just even touching on Jordi Alba there, I think for me, his best part of the game was really in the last 10 minutes. For some reason, when Oyarzabal came on, it seemed like he was more willing to kind of make these runs forward, and he had the confidence to do that, and he was unlocked by Pedri. But that's not good enough, I think, because the Spanish side needs to take their chances. They need to create as many chances as possible, and Jordi Alba is sort of brought there to kind of pair up with Marcos Llorente in terms of creating these players who would make run forwards. And you can see so many teams in the Euros who play either 3-back or even a 4-back, like Italy, where they have Spinazzola, where they're able to actually use their fullbacks and utilize the kind of offensive prowess that they have. And for me, Alba wasn't able to do that. He seemed a little bit unconfident in terms of making those runs forward. And I think Jose Gaya gives you that. And I think he deserves a chance to play because every time he's put on the Spanish shirt, for these kind of big international friendly matches, I think he's delivered. So for me, that's another alternative that Spain needs to look to. Another thing, of course, was the substitution of Koke, for example, or actually Rodri as well, for Thiago. What do you think the impact of maybe like playing Thiago was, and do you think he deserves to start going forwards? Do Spain kind of change their structure where Rodri is very static?
Well, I mean, I originally wanted a midfield of Rodri, Thiago, and Pedri to start because I feel like it has the balance of, with Rodri's physicality and holding that position in between the center halves, Thiago with his ability to switch the play, and Pedri with his lateral runs. But man, watching Thiago come in yesterday as a substitute, his performance for me was below the quality that you would expect from him. He's an assurance when he's on the ball with his passes, but he couldn't string those passes right yesterday. He was giving the ball away at times. He couldn't either release it through his feet or look to do the trademark Thiago passes over the top,
Yeah,
spread the field over. And like we were talking about the synergy, right? This team needs to gel together. They need to have to play. You want a same system, same players, roughly again starting together, so they can build those partnerships. So that moving on as you progress, if you progress into the later stages of the tournament, you were able to go ahead with it. So I am also kind of surprised because two performances against the one against Germany, the 6-0, and the Portugal, which was an excellent performance, bar the fact that they couldn't finish. Gaya was there. So for me, I think Thiago might not start because I think Koke does give you that sort of energy. You do lack that sort of switch of play, but maybe I think it's worth at the moment. If the first half, performance is to go by anything, maybe the Spanish side could go stick with this side just so that you can build that sort of synergy, at least with the players already on there, and then maybe plug in one or two players according to that, depending on the game or performances, so that there is some sort of flow with the lineups and the tactics that are going. And I think looking at the subs that came on, um, bar Moreno, I do think a lot of them kind of struggled to really impact onto the game. I felt like Fabian Ruiz as well kind of struggled to get his touches right. So did Oyarzabal for a bit. I don't know if that was the pitch or maybe
yeah,
because I felt like the Spanish players in the first half as well in the beginning
yeah.
kind
There
of
were a few
took us some
misplaced
time.
passes.
Yeah, so that could, you could say that maybe the pitch was something that they weren't used to, or they needed to give me like play a little bit into it. But I do feel maybe subs didn't do enough besides Moreno to stake a claim to be in the starting 11 for the next game, at least for
Yeah.
me.
Mm. I think the nice thing was that that last 10 minutes for Spain did show a little bit of promise once again. The second half was much more dismaying, I think, compared to the first in terms of chances created. And then suddenly I think things started to flow a little bit better after, Oyarzabal had misplaced a few passes. Then suddenly a lot more confidence from Jordi Alba pushing forwards. And even Sarabia was kind of trying to create these kind of inverted passes, as you were telling me, at the end of last night's game. And that seemed to be a bit more utilization of the right flank, because I think unfortunately Ferran Torres and Marcos Llorente didn't really get things right, and also maybe Koke was also playing a bit defensively on that flank. So I think one of the things that you see in the structure is that Koke covers a lot of distance, but he still plays a little bit too defensive for my liking, and that kind of takes away Spain's opportunity to create these triangles between the right hand side, and that's why we saw a lot more left hand dominance. And with Morata kind of looking a little bit further down, then there's no avenue to kind of exploit the center. So Spain really needs to, I think, play with Moreno. And I like Koke starting because I think he gives you that uh, kind of energy that I think Luis Enrique's side now seems to be posturing. Because for me, I think the overarching themes is to kind of reduce Spain to being a very kind of boring possession side that really doesn't create chances. But for me, the difference is that this side does create chances, and this side has a lot more energy than any of the sides that we've seen in the last 8 years. Because since the last time Spain won the Euros, they've been awful and they've gotten progressively worse. The only exception, I think, would be the tenure under Lopetegui, where we saw, honestly, prime Isco playing in a structure where Iniesta and David Silva were perfectly utilized. And it was scintillating football, but of course it was kind of run down by all the kind of drama with Lopetegui's kind of pre-contract with Real Madrid. So with the exception of that era of Spain, I think this side provides a lot more difference in terms of the energy, and really you can see it by the kind of distance covered. And the reason why Spain actually has high possession, as I mentioned earlier, isn't because they're just passing around. It's actually, even with all their misplaced passes, as we saw, like a lot of uncharacteristic passes, these were kind of unforced errors, as you'd say in tennis. So it wasn't actually because the passing accuracy was fantastic in Spain, but it was because they were pressing so well and their recoveries. And the recoveries were fantastic as well. So you could see, like, for example, Marcus Llorente, even if he makes a mistake, a misplaced pass, he instantly kind of falls back into position and instantly tries to pressure the players in space. Whereas in the previous Spanish systems, we'd see a collapse, a lot of players overloaded forwards and no one with the awareness to be, like going backwards. And we saw so many famous counterattacks against Spain, the same way. Like look at Netherlands versus Spain as a classic example in that World Cup, where I think you could see the fall of the Spanish era, where, Van Persie and Robin were really killing them. And now I think you can see the Spanish side. They're a lot more vibrant, a lot more youthful. And I can understand why Luis Enrique has gone with this group of players. And I think Koke is that kind of talismanic player in terms of someone who presents like what this new Spanish side looks as, despite him being a more veteran player, right? He's just someone who didn't feature in that kind of golden era. But he is like a big player, I think, in this team. And I think he deserves to continue to start. Thiago, I think, is an interesting option. I think the reason why people pick Rodri is probably due to the fact that he gives you that kind of physicality. And once again, that's like that kind of change that Spain needed to go to. I think you look at Busquets in recent times and his inability to kind of, continue running against his opponents who are just simply running past him, is a feature of Spanish sides that needs to be eradicated. And I think Luis Enrique has kind of tried to remove that by, moving on to these kind of new groups of players. And for me, I think going forwards, the Spanish side can only get better because the attacking triangles and the kind of synergy, as you mentioned, on the left wing and the right wing can only get better, I think. There were a lot of simple misplaced passes that I would not expect from a regular Spanish side. And these players are of quality, I think, really with exception to, Morata as an example. I think in terms of the clinical finishing, that's going to be a question mark, I think, all tournament long, because perhaps Moreno is still ultimately not the best soul striker that the Spanish side has. And I think many people question as well why Aspas wasn't brought into the tournament. But how do you feel generally, like watching the Spanish side, watching Luis Enrique for the last 3 years, and how do they compare to your expectations of previous versions of Spain?
Well, I mean, I what I like about is they brought that energy, but they've kept that sort of Spanish DNA with them. We've talked about the tiki-taka, we talk about possession, but it's about how you utilize that possession, right? He understands that it's not just you're going to keep the ball and look to, hold there and the possession is the game. The other team can just sit deep, but this is constantly creating frustrations for the oppositions with those runs in behind, and that puts a lot of stress on the opposition, right? Because they have to switch on, because if at one moment they switch off, they know they're going to be caught out. And yesteryears, you had the possession base where it would be slow build up. The opposition has time to breathe and take their time, and maybe it's easier to actually kind of set up against teams in a low block. But with this setup, it's a bit hard because you will have those off the ball runners. You'll have a lot of movement in those spaces. It's a bit difficult. Yeah, they're a bit raw compared to the quality that's come before this, but I think the team has enough to go on. Maybe with one or two positions to looked at, like you mentioned, like Gaya could come in. An alternative to Morata would be good. I am also a little worried about the two left center backs. There were moments, as we were talking about, like sometimes when you wanted to move the ball onto the right side, play through the right back in Lorente or to Torres. Um, Laporte looked a little dodgy because he was not so comfortable playing in that position, right? He's always played as a left center back or a left back, and most left-footed center backs always play on that left-hand side, whereas right center backs, they play right and left. It's just, I don't know why, but this seems to be a lot of the kind of the theme that's been going on for so long. But it was nice to see that you've got two quality center backs with the passing ability on there, maybe with a bit more experience and regularity in those same positions. If Laporte has constantly played there with Torres, they might get used to it. It's something they need to work on because the opposition will be looking at this and they might want to attack Laporte as soon as he's receiving the ball on his weaker foot. That could be maybe a downside. But then again, you have the likes of Koke and Lorente on that side. Those are two workhorses who are going to be providing cover. And I think that is why maybe Koke has been sort of tasked to play in this position, because he gives you that energy and that defense to create that sort of breathing space for Laporte. So I personally think this team is actually quite exciting. maybe they might not score goals, but if you watch them play, they do create those chances
Yes, yeah.
with a bit of luck and maybe a little bit like confidence going through. I think they could create some upsets. I think they are a team that people have kind of think that maybe they're not doing well, but I think coming into the tournament as well, watching the game against Portugal, I personally thought they were better than the other team. They're still inexperienced with, this team hasn't, like as we mentioned, played together. But I feel if not this tournament, the next World Cup, they're going to be looking to create a lot of problems.
Yeah, I think so. And as you were talking about the double kind of left center backs, I think the key thing here is, of course, like when you look at a player like Ramos, who's right-footed, but he just plays domestically as a left center back, right? He's so used to passing to the left or switching to the right. It's
Yeah,
clear that Laporte isn't used to that right now, and he needs to get better. Like the speed of the pass is, I think, what actually this system provides, and I think it demands. And I think that's what I like about the Spanish side. I think they try to shift the ball as fast as possible compared to previous sides where they were passing back aimlessly. And I think the bulk of the passes would go through the center backs, which was the most depressing thing about the previous kind of Spanish iterations. And as you said, once again, the difference between this side and the sides that have disappointed in the previous kind of international competitions is chances created. I think in the last World Cup, Spain had very, very poor chances created, with the exception of that kind of Portugal game, which was like a high variance, high volatility game. But look at what they played versus a low block. This was a good example of Spain actually doing well versus a low block in terms of finally being able to create chances. You compare that to the Russia game in the last World Cup, where they were playing a clear low block as well. No chances created really. And I think that's the kind of improvement that we've seen from Spain. And I think it's very much welcomed amongst the Spanish audiences. And for me, I think going forwards, like the expectations for Spain are at least to really go through to the round of 8, because I still expect Spain to actually qualify as first place in this group. And they're likely to play versus an easier opponent in the round of 16. And that gives them a chance to continue building on these synergies and to develop going forwards. And ultimately, I think for me, what's interesting about Spain is that they have players, at least, on the bench, who at least allow them to continue playing within that structure. So whilst I wouldn't say they have the deepest bench in the world, they have almost players for every single position to be kind of replaced and kind of keep that kind of structure of play and keep that intensity. I think what I liked about the substitutes, even though they weren't great, is that they continued to play in that same mind, and the intensity and the energy just kind of improved overall. When you looked at previous like World Cups, I think, and for example, international competitions, the substitutes that Spain had on the left wing, on the right wing, or even in the striker position were very, very thin. For example, when tournaments where they were playing Thiago Costa, they had to completely change the structure to, for example, suddenly accommodate for someone like Rodrigo or someone like Aspas, who plays completely different from that kind of target striker. Here, at least, you have Ferran Torres with depth in terms of Sarabia. You have Dani Olmo, who can be replaced by Oyarzabal, as we saw yesterday. And that's what I like. I think Luis Enrique, at least, is trying to stick with his philosophy, and he has players that at least fulfill it. And of course, people can criticize the fact that he brought 2 less players to this tournament, but at least I can see what he's trying to do. And I think he's the type of manager who believes in kind of carrying out, his vision. And I think it would be interesting to see how far Spain can go.
Just before we end, what do you think of Eric Garcia, and do you think that maybe he should get a chance to play as a right center back if the Laporte, the double left-footed center back pair doesn't work?
Honestly, like I think I've watched Eric Garcia plenty of times in Man City, even though he actually hasn't played plenty. But I've watched every game he's played in a Man City shirt, and for me, the issue with him as a player isn't offensively in terms of whether he can actually contribute to the Spanish build-up, and it's just you lose so much defensively with him. And I think the mark of the Spanish side now is that you have players who can compete, on a physical level with the other teams, and they can maybe even outrun players, because this is actually the way Enrique wants to play. Look at how Luis Enrique used to play as a footballer. He was very kind of box to box. He was someone who would really use his physicality to the most extent. And for me, Eric Garcia doesn't present any of that in his own football. I think I've seen him being beat kind of like on pace by Jamie Vardy, for example. If you watched early in the season in the Premier League when Leicester beat Man City 5-0, and then when Eric Garcia was kind of given garbage time games when Man City had already won the league at the back of the season, I've also seen him being beaten physically. And for me, because of that, he is such a kind of question mark for me. And I mean, he's the only real question mark for me in terms of the squad. And I think the idea that you don't have Nacho in the squad is once again super questionable because he is actually a right centre back, you know, and even a right back potentially, someone who can actually perhaps fill in the space for Marcos Llorente in terms of defense, maybe not necessarily attack, but he for me is like that kind of key question mark alongside Aspas. But I think Enrique is, if he's lucky enough to continue having Laporte and Pau Torres, barring no kind of injuries or COVID restrictions, I don't think we'll see Eric Garcia grace the field. And honestly, I wouldn't want to see him grace the field, but that's just me.
Well, there you have it, guys. We hope you like this podcast, this conversation. So if you want to leave a like or a comment, do let us know what you think about this game, and maybe what you think how far this Spanish side could go.